调至静音状态，谢谢合作。
Distinguished guests, the conference will start soon. Please be seated and set your...
尊敬的各位来宾，大会即将开始，请您尽快就座，并将手机等通讯设备调至静音状态，谢谢合作。
Distinguished guests, the conference will start soon. Please be seated and set your mobile phones and other communication devices to the silent mode. Thank you for your cooperation.
尊敬的各位来宾，大会即将开始，请您尽快就座，并将手机等通讯设备调至静音状态，谢谢合作。
Distinguished guests, the conference will start soon. Please be seated and set your mobile phones and other communication devices to the silent mode. Thank you for your cooperation.
接下来，我们将进行2.2全球经济展望与挑战环节，有请主持人及演讲嘉宾上台。
We will now start the 2.2 Global Economic Outlook and Challenges. Let's welcome the moderator and speakers.
Well, Excellencies, distinguished guests, welcome to this session. We've had some really interesting sessions so far, emphasizing the challenges that which a global economy is having to go through. Following the geoeconomic fragmentation we've begun to see, then of course we've had the COVID shock, we've had the post-COVID inflationary surge. So it's a particularly difficult macroeconomic environment, as we've already discussed in some of the sessions. And we have a really wonderful panel here this morning to take us through the global economic outlook now, looking ahead, not only to the next couple of years, but to how we navigate this rather difficult period. I'm going to introduce colleagues in the order in which they will speak, and they will each say a few introductory remarks. And then we will go in through a discussion. And I hope you'll be able to also think of some questions, because I will open it up following their some initial discussion with the panel. I'm going to do it in a slightly different order than they're on the stage, simply because we've discussed earlier that there was a more logical sequence in how we will present. We're going to have initially Ian Coase, who's the Deputy Chief Economist and Director of Prospects Group at the World Bank Group. And Ian is going to go through some presentation around the current global economic outlook from the World Bank perspective. And that will then allow us to sort of focus on that. We'll then be following with remarks by Joachim Levy, who's Director of Economic Strategy and Market Relations at the Banco Safra Brazil, former Finance Minister, of course, of Brazil, and former Managing Director and CFO of the World Bank Group. Following that, we'll go to Eric Berkloff, who's Chief Economist of the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. And after that, we have Reza Bakir, who is Managing Director and Global Head of Sovereign Advisory Services at Alvarez & Marsal, Research Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, and former Governor of the State Bank of Pakistan. And last but not least, we will have remarks from Shan Hui, who's Chief China Economist at Goldman Sachs. So let's begin. Ian, will you take us through some of your perspective on this? And I think you've got a presentation, so over to you.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here to this wonderful conference. I very much enjoy the conversations and exchanges so far, but I'm very happy to see so many friends from my time in the IMF and the World Bank here, and meet new colleagues. So I am the designated PowerPoint presenter for this entire conference. Okay. Entire conference, I'm the only one doing the PowerPoint. And hopefully it will go well and we learn something. What I plan to do is tell you how we are thinking about the global economy. These are our forecasts. Some of them are from June, but most of them are pretty much the same. We will release our new global economic prospects in January. So we are working on that, and we can talk about the state of the global economy. What I will do very quickly, I will talk about three issues: how we see the near-term prospects, especially in the context of global growth and inflation and monetary policy. And then I will talk about three critical structural issues related to debt, demographics, and climate. And then I will conclude with some broad observations. So first, how shall we think about global growth? Now, this figure is not unfamiliar to you, but I put something there that should be interesting, growth over the period 2026 to 2030, the average. So what is the big message here? Wherever you look around the world, the country groups, there is stability in growth. For the global economy as a whole, growth give and take around 2.6% this year. This is different than how the IMF calculates, but these numbers are quite comparable. We use market exchange rate weights. IMF uses PPP weights, but there are different reasons for that. The big observation is that next year, a little bit of a pickup in growth, but then this trend slowdown in economic growth continues for the rest of this decade, 2026 to 30. The pickup has a good reason, mostly because of monetary policy easing and driven by the US outperformers, and our hope that Europe will do better next year than this year. Now, if you look at advanced economies, growth settles around 1.6%. That's not very surprising. Next year, a little bit of a pickup. US, surprise on the upside, multiple years that will continue, we believe, at least next year and the following year. In the context of emerging developing economies, growth is around 4%. In this region, let me make sure I give you the right numbers. This year growth, a little bit below 5, around 4.8. China as well, we think around 4.8. Next year, growth will slow to 4.4 for East Asia Pacific, and for China, a little bit below 4.5%. But if you take out China from emerging developing economy group and out of East Asia Pacific, you see growth a little bit picking up actually in these country groups, excluding China. So the big observation here, there is stability in growth after a period of turbulence and multiple shocks. That's the first observation, and that's something I think good. But the not so good observation is that growth is much weaker than what we saw prior to the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic growth was a little bit above 3, now settling around 2.6. So it's like 20% decline in growth we see. And that slowdown will continue in the near future. So the second observation about risks. There are multiple downside risks. I think many of them we discussed yesterday and today. But there are also some upside risks, and those upside risks are quite relevant in the current context. So what are the downside risks? I think one, the kind of the geopolitical tensions and armed conflict and escalation of those, well articulated. Second, the further trade fragmentation that has been happening in all likelihood will accelerate with adverse implications for economic growth. But in addition to that, there is basically possibility of even more heightened policy uncertainty with very serious consequences for financial markets as well as for the real economy. Now, as I will discuss, beating interest rates will remain elevated, but even higher interest rates possible against the background of these debt challenges, as well as maybe persistent inflation. In the context of climate, the more natural disasters, the more frequent natural disasters. And of course, when you look at basically 5 years, 10 years ahead, even weaker than what we are expecting now, economic growth. That's a possibility, especially because of demographic challenges. So what are the upside risks? There are different reasons why this might happen, but we might see a sharper reduction in inflation that will translate into basically faster monetary policy easing. And that will have implications, of course, for growth. Another important, I think, upside risk that could easily happen stronger than expected growth in the case of China and the United States. There are different reasons for that, but both of these countries have, the kind of the plans or backup plans that can deliver when it comes to policy to translate into higher growth. So what about inflation? We had inflation, around 8%, not long time ago, around July 2022. The latest numbers are around 3%. We think that this inflation process will continue, but there might be bumps on the road, especially because of these strong labor markets and still quite persistent services inflation and the core inflation. Now, we think monetary policy easing will also continue, but at the end, we will come to a point, these terminal rates will settle when we think about advanced economies around 3%, much higher than what we saw, of course, over the period 2010 to 19, and close to the rates we saw prior to the global financial crisis. This will have implications for, servicing the debt and rolling over debt in many places around the world. The big issue with respect to trade is the following. Trade has been weak. By the end of this year, we will have on average trade growth that's going to be the weakest half-decade average since the early 1990s. So the trade is weak, and that weakness was quite pronounced last year. This year, there is a little bit of recovery, about 2%, and next year we are expecting even a higher trade growth. But when you look at the trade growth, the global economy delivered since early 2000 up until the pandemic, these numbers are much lower than what we saw before. So is it the byproduct of these latest trade restrictions we see weaker growth? The answer to that question is no. The trade weakness is a byproduct of the weakness we see in investment growth around the world. Investment and trade go hand in hand. Now, in the context of trade distortions, obviously the number of these distortions has been increasing. But what happened is, before the pandemic, most of these restrictions were defensive restrictions, basically tariffs introduced by countries on imports coming from other countries. Now, increasingly, these restrictions relate to domestic distortions to protect certain industries in the service of industrial policy. So the nature of restrictions has been changing, and it is becoming everywhere increasingly more inward-looking policies than the types of policies we saw before 2016, with serious consequences. Now, let me turn to this issue of structural challenges. The number one challenge is debt. And you see how debt, the total debt, has increased on the left panel here since basically over the past two decades. In 2010, the total debt, the private sector debt and the public sector debt in advanced economies was around 210%. Now that's around 240%. And the big increase has been driven by the public sector. So the government debt was the main driver of debt accumulation in advanced economies. In the context of emerging developing economies, the debt went up from around 120 to close to 200%, primarily driven by the private sector. The public sector also accumulated quite a bit of debt. In fact, increased that debt by about twofold. But the private sector was the main driver of debt accumulation in emerging developing economies. Now, debt is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with accumulating debt as long as you are able to grow. But the first observation I made is growth is slowing. So we see this rapid debt accumulation in an environment, growth has been slowing, And as you see on the right, fiscal revenues are not increasing. So on the one hand, you see debt is rising. On the other hand, you see growth is slowing, and there is not much appetite to increase fiscal revenues in advanced economies, for that matter, in emerging developing economies. Of course, what happens, this basically invites a kind of a explosive combination of forces that could end, with tears. Two quick observations. One, about this demographic challenge. So the demographic challenge, like the climate challenge, has always been with us. But like the climate challenge, we wanted to basically postpone thinking about demographics. The truth is that over the next 6 years, we will see more than 700 million people coming into job market, needing jobs, especially in emerging developing economies. Where are these people? These people are in countries, they account for a minuscule fraction of global output. So as you see on the left, very soon, give and take 5 to 10 years from now, emerging developing economies will join advanced economies in terms of the slowdown in working age population. So the working age population is going to increase in around 70, 75 economies. These are low-income countries or lower middle-income countries with limited economic activity. And the people they bring to the global job market will need jobs. And if we don't find those jobs, of course, that will have serious consequences. So that's number one urgent challenge. The second urgent challenge is that the climate problem is like the fiscal problems we think, or the kind of the health challenges we think, an urgent challenge. This year will be the warmest year we have seen in history. There is this July temperature anomaly. That July temperature anomaly is like this year 1.2%, 1.2 degrees centigrade higher temperature we saw on average than previous century. So the problem with global warming and the idea of keeping the warming less than 2 Celsius degrees increasingly becoming more and more important, while there is a possibility we will get to that 2 degrees centigrade at a much faster pace during the next decade. So finally, what is the upside with all these structural challenges? I think the upside in the context of climate is the following. On the one hand, there are very significant financing needs to overcome the climate problem, especially in emerging developing economies. Depending on the country group you look at, these challenges will require countries invest every year in and out around 5 to 8% of their GDP. We talk about trillions. Those are good numbers, but we need to think about at the country level what it means. At the country level, 5 to 8%. Now, is it possible to deliver that type of investment? When you look at the history, it is possible countries to deliver much faster investment growth. In fact, when they delivered much faster investment growth, they were able to translate that into graduation from low income to middle income, graduation from middle income to high income. But every time these types of investment booms taken place, and many of them taken place over the past 7 decades in advanced economies, in emerging developing economies, we saw much faster investment growth, much faster output growth. We saw improvements in fiscal positions. We saw even a decline in inflation, primarily because these episodes were triggered by comprehensive reforms. So finally, what did I say? 3 messages. Growth is stable, but much weaker than we had before. Growth is like a medication. You can use it to solve many problems. But increasingly, that medication is in short supply. Risks are there, very serious downside risk, but there are some upside risk for the near term. The second point is about inflation and interest rates, very much related to these structural issues I mentioned, but interest rates will remain elevated and probably higher than what markets expect now. And finally, the policy priorities. At the global level, we need to safeguard trade openness. There are different ways to do that, but not just safeguarding the system, but safeguarding trade openness. Continue supporting green and digital transition, and deliver debt relief to those countries. They need debt relief. It's critical. At the national level, we need to basically think about the fiscal challenges. For many countries, those fiscal challenges are increasingly prohibitive, and address this, issue in the context of labor markets. At the end of the day, problems do not solve themselves. Problems will require solutions, and if you let them fester, they become bigger, and it becomes more costly to solve them. Finally, I need to show this slide. Please visit the webpage. We have a lot of work done on these issues, and we will soon release a new study taking stock of what happened in the global economy over the first quarter of this century. So, thank you.
Hi, and thank you very much for setting the scene so well for us. So the other speakers are going to just take deeper dives into some of the risks and opportunities that Diane has set out so well. And I'm going to start with Joachim. I think you're going to, in your initial remarks, you're going to focus on the US, I think. So over to you.
Okay, well, I think that was a great overview, and most of us probably are in agreement with the challenges and so on. But I couldn't help taking this occasion to think a little bit of what we could expect on the US. It's a very hard task, and probably I'll be wrong. But I think that we just had the nomination of a new Treasury Secretary, and it's worth thinking what we might expect from him. I think that we're going increasingly to hear about the problem of the debt in the US. The secretary, I mean, we all know, has worked in financial markets. He knows pretty much how markets respond to macro decisions and the imbalances and so on. So I think that we may presume that he'll be very careful. Probably the first decision he'll have to take is it really time to reignite the economy, like he used to say? I mean, some of you may have been at the IMF meetings where he spoke in a number of sessions, and also probably saw some videos of him. So I think in your scenario, is it really time that you need to reignite the economy? What that means for interest rates? And the second thing is how you reignite in the short term. It'll be tax cuts. How you do that concerning, I mean, ratings and the dollar and so on. So I presume that he'll be very careful, because not the least, we know that probably one shock is going to happen with the shock with the labor markets. I mean, we all know, or many of us believe, that immigration helped quite a lot to have this transition and lower inflation the last 3 years. So you have a major shock there. It's already something quite drastic for the economy. And it is quite likely to happen, maybe not in the dimension that some fear, which will mean that he probably will have to hold on other things. He also has mentioned a number of times that, well, this talk about tariffs is a negotiation tool. What exactly that means, we don't know. So we cannot be complacent. I think I take my own country, Brazil. You're kind of preparing two big waves. Maybe it will not be that drastic, but we have to be prepared, and I think a number of countries have to prepare. And also, and this I may leave for the next rounds, we have to continue to look beyond this first, let's say, wave or storm or whatever name we want to give it, and to address some of the issues and continue believing with the cooperation. When we see your chart on climate and all the discussions we have even this morning at the opening session, it's clear that we are going to need a lot of cooperation. And as I mentioned in the sustainable finance session, I think the big news is how much the new forms of energy, renewable energy, and so on, have become, say, affordable, and with a minimum of cooperation, we can move forward quite dramatically. You have to look at special cases, but also was mentioned in the evening. I mean, the contribution of China to that is very important. I think we will continue to be important, and also other elements that you help there, like biofuels and so on. And in all these things, trade will remain important. So without going too much on that, I think the message is that I would expect from someone who has been working with the financial markets on basically bets on macro and macro imbalances, to be quite careful in implementing the policies. On the other hand, we know that the US, I mean, I remember Bob Luckett would say often, I do what I mean and I mean what I do. So I think we always have to keep this in mind when we think about the West. So be prepared, but not be too worried, and let's continue to strive for more cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joachim. That's a good, positive way to kick off. But I think, Eric, I think you're going to talk a bit more about the trade risks around here, the geoeconomic fragmentation that was highlighted by Ian. So over to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to try to tie together a few themes from Ian's excellent presentation. So on the one hand, the trade and investment fragmentation, and on the other hand, development growth and also climate change. So there's no question, I think, that we have seen increased protectionism. According to some calculations, in the last decade, it's gone basically triple the number of restrictions in place. And just as a kind of illustration, looking at what all the things that were done to restrict the trade of medical goods during COVID, you would have expected them to disappear now, but they actually have increased after. So we are in a dangerous territory. And the evidence of fragmentation for a long time wasn't really there, but mostly they were about anecdotes. But thanks to excellent work by IMF and WTO, we see now that trade within blocks has developed better than trade across blocks. And it's not just about trade, it's also about financial integration. Financial integration between blocks is much lower than within blocks. Technology, we see increasing interaction, or between restrictions on technology and block structures. FDIs, again, IMF has done excellent work showing that the FDI flows have become more affected by these geopolitical structures. These restrictions are not always working as was intended. We have seen a lot of rerouting, for example, of global value chains via third countries. Good work by BIS showing that these global value chains have not really decreased in importance. They have just become a bit longer and possibly a bit more inefficient as a result. And I think we cannot really see a lot of evidence on job losses from these restrictions. But I think there's no doubt that there's more emphasis on protection and security, supply resilience, and so on. And I think you can actually argue that in many ways, global value chains, because of the stress during COVID and the developments after that, have in many ways become more resilient. So maybe that's something that we should hope for. And when we look at what the new administration in U.S. May come up with, I won't go into. I think Joaquin did a very nice job of summarizing. I think what we will probably see. But even if we saw the most extreme expressions, I think we shouldn't be too concerned, because particularly when we look at the impact on China of some of these restrictions, they the direct impact of a 10% increase in US tariffs on all imports, that would only be a fraction of the GDP of the Eurozone, for example. And in China, export of goods to the US are less than 3% of China's GDP. And if you look at the whole picture, looking at offsets in other countries and some tariff evasion and so on, probably we are talking about 1 or 2% of GDP. So yes, this could be significant, but it's not, particularly if they are not implemented to the extent that is being proposed. Having said all this, I think that when we look at trade fragmentation over time, and if it becomes persistent, I think there are very serious risks. Global value chains have been perhaps the most important lever for countries to join global production arrangements and to get growth, and particularly in Asia. And I think that is something that we really have to watch out for. We saw in COVID, the countries that dropped out of the global value chain were the late entrants, mostly emerging and developing countries. When these GVCs came back, those countries came back into these arrangements. But that's, I think, is something that we should really look at. The last point I wanted to make is that, we are, and that was very much illustrated by this chart of we are going into a period where we're going to need these global value chains to implement standards. Yesterday I spoke at the conference on the implementation of ISSP standards. This is going to be extremely important, and the most important lever we have for that are these global value chains. If we threaten these arrangements, that could have very serious impact on our ability to fight climate change. So maybe I'll stop there with the floor. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. And Reza, I think you're going to look at another of the challenges that Ian highlighted, which is around public debt challenges and how that may impact on the outlook. So over to you.
Thank you, Sir Anton. Let me begin, if you allow me, Sir Anton, to just pick up on what Joaquin was saying. And I very much agree with his overall punchline about being prepared but not being too worried. But I wanted to just expand a little bit on US interest rates outlook and I think some related issues. And then I'll talk very quickly about debt. So on US interest rates, as I was thinking about this session, I was looking at a headline from the New York Times that said the market is betting Trump will bring higher inflation interest rates. So this headline is not from now, it's from 2016. And I think it's a good window for us to go back and look what happened back then. And I did. And actually, the discourse and discussion is very similar to what you see in the press right now. And then if you look at what happened back at that time, say to one of the measures of inflation expectations, which is the 5-year break-even rate, it rose by about 50 basis points in the run-up to the assumption of the new administration. If you see now, it's been pretty much the same. The increase in the 5-year break-even rates since September of this year has been about 50 basis points. So 50 basis points is, of course, more than zero, but it's also not a very, very large increase as well. A little bit more concerning is perhaps the increase in the 5-year Treasury yield. which is more relevant for many emerging markets who have to fund themselves. That's risen by about 100 basis points. That's still a bit more, but not, the kind of levels that we saw recently when inflation was much high. So yes, just echoing a bit what Joaquin said, but it doesn't seem to be too much, at least at this stage. The more interesting issue that I expect to come up in the context of, I think, US interest rates and monetary policy, I expect there to be more discussion will emerge around central bank mandates. Whether or not President Trump does or say something about, his own central bank governor, I think the discussion around the extent of central bank independence and their accountability is something I expect will get more attention, because I think there will be comments around the Fed and what it should and what it should not be doing. In the COVID pandemic, I think central banks demonstrated that they can be very, very powerful. They have very powerful tools. And there's already some discussion about what should be the accountability if they're so powerful. And, countries around the world have taken various approaches. If you look at many important regions of the world, central banks don't have as much independence as, say, New Zealand, which started off this whole discussion. So I think some return to the attention around central bank independence and mandates and accountability. But let me move on then to the issue of public debt. And Diane, shared with us some of the numbers around overall debt. What is striking to me is, if I take a step back, the fact that debt burdens have been rising for emerging markets is not new. They have consistently been rising over the past several years. They rose significantly during COVID. What happened subsequently was what was the big cause for alarm and concern, which was that the capital markets effectively closed for many countries because of the high rates in the US. Now, when I see what's happened since is actually good news on surface, because capital markets have now reopened, correct? And many countries that previously could not tap are now issuing in record numbers. But if you put the two thoughts together, the debt burdens have been rising, and now capital markets have reopened, and in fact, countries are borrowing more, then I just want to bring attention to the fact that more borrowing is not the answer when debt is the underlying problem. And that the structural issue of debt is not going away. It's actually going to continue to grow. And in fact, will probably get more pronounced because countries are going to be able to borrowing more. And when we do all the analysis of how emerging markets and low-income countries got into trouble, it's because the concessional flows that they were used to dried up after the HIPC and MDRI debt relief initiatives, because when the advanced countries had to give big write-downs, they stopped lending on concessional terms. Many countries turned to domestic debt as well as to borrowing in the markets. Now that rates are considerably lower than what they used to be 2 years ago, and they're going to borrow more. The issue of debt is not going away. It's going to be there. Now, what is being done about the issue of debt? I think there's been a lot of talk and a lot of, even in Ayan's presentation, I saw, one punchline, give debt relief, which is very good. But who is going to give that debt relief? And then it gets very contentious. Some people would like the MDBs to give debt relief. I think the World Bank was on the hook for a while from countries like China and then managed to escape. But the question is, who is going to give this debt relief? And, there is a strong divide in the camps, between two camps. There's a camp that says, just give some rescheduling. And that's known as just, for lack of a better word, the extend and pretend camp. Just extend the maturities, give some rescheduling, give these countries a chance, they'll get out of their debt problems. And then there is a camp out there, which is, no, give them comprehensive debt relief, which is, you can call it the one and done camp, that just do it once, give a big amount of comprehensive debt relief, and then countries, won't have to come back. So I see both of these camps out there in all the discussions around, what needs to be done with the debt burdens. The only comment I wanted to add was that from my experience in working on sovereign debt issues, including with Siddharth when he was the head of SPR, and we did many things on sovereign debt issues, I have consistently seen the extend and pretend camp win against the one and done camp. And probably nothing will happen, but if something does happen, I doubt if it will be any more than a rescheduling type of an operation. Let me stop there. I wanted to come back on, I think, given all of these developments, what should emerging markets do? How should they position themselves against this global outlook? But maybe in the subsequent rounds of discussions, happy to come in on that.
Thank you, Reza. And yes, we will come back to that because I really would like people to say a bit more about how the different actors will play on this stage. So now the next big player on the world stage in China, we've had a bit on the United States. So Hui, it's over to you and to say a bit about how you think China will play in the global economic outlook. Over to you.
Thanks. And we just put out our 2025 China macro outlook, and the title of the outlook is Leaning Against the Wind. The reason for us to use that title is even before the US election, Chinese economy was facing headwind. And my prestigious co-panelists talked about debt, demographics, and tariffs and fragmentation. These are all challenges facing China. Think about demographics. China's population aging is going to be faster than any other major economy. Debt problem a few weeks ago, the Chinese government announced a 10 trillion RMB debt resolution plan for local government implicit debt. And after the US election, it's almost certainly US will impose tariffs on China. So the decoupling, de-risking, global supply chain, these are all headwinds that China has to navigate going forward. When preparing our panel, before we head up stage, my co-panelists asked me to talk about how would China respond to Trump tariffs. So if you don't like my comments on this, how China is going to navigate tariffs is their fault. I think if there are three things to keep in mind. One is that pretty obviously nobody knows what exactly going to happen, whether the tariffs will be tariffs for the sake of a tariffs or as the negotiation tactics, nobody knows. Whether it's a 20%, 40%, 60%, nobody knows. So the first comment I want to make about how China is going to respond is that we don't know, but we think almost certainly China will be facing tariffs, and the response will be dependent on how the tariffs are imposed, at what level. Is it just China, or there will also be tariffs on other countries? It's very much like central banks, the data dependent. I think Chinese policymakers' reaction function will be US action or US tariff dependent. That's the first point to make. Now, in making forecasts, we do have to have a baseline. We can't just tell investors anything can happen. So our baseline is that US will impose a 20% tariff on Chinese goods, and that can happen very quickly because all those 301 investigations were done for tariffs on other economies. Might take a while, maybe second half of next year, but for China, as early as first quarter next year, we could see tariffs imposed on China. And China's reaction to a hypothetical 20% tariff includes some RMB depreciation. We saw some of that in the 2018-19 trade war experience, and some domestic stimulus, just given the headwinds we're facing in the Chinese economy. So, the first point I make is that it depends on what's being announced and the interplay between China and the US, but here are our baseline expectations. Second point I want to make is that in terms of specific actions, what China can do to retaliate, and because China exports a lot more than China buys from the US, I don't think adding tariffs, if the US has a 20%, China is going to announce 20% tariff, I don't necessarily think that's the sort of centerpiece of China's reaction function. I think the supply chain could be important to watch, just given China's comprehensive industrial base and dominant position in certain parts of the supply chain. So this could be a powerful tool in this dynamic and tariff discussions. And I think geopolitical events and issues could be on the table as well, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, whether it's North Korea. We're economists, we don't make political predictions, but that could be part of the puzzle as well. So that's the second sort of point I want to make. That's not just about how much tariff US is imposing and how much tariff China is retaliating. You have to think outside the box, and there are other dimensions that could come into play in this very complex situation. The last point I want to make is that in thinking about how China is going to react, I think there are some powerful structural trends that's going to happen regardless of this trade war 2.0, how that plays out. One of which is, the other panelists talked about the economic and geopolitical blocks. I give you an example. We look at the 2022 US hour FDI data and China hour FDI data, and then look at what are the countries, top 20 countries, the US hour FDI going to, and what are the top 20 countries, the Chinese hour FDI going to. The interesting observation is that not a single country overlap in US top 20 and China's top 20. That tells you something about how blocks economically, geopolitically, things are happening. And that's before, that's 2022 data, when we are doing analysis, the latest available. That's before the US election tariff discussions even came to fore. So I think that's one trend that's going to happen regardless. And domestically, even when the Chinese government, we're expecting them to increase monetary policy easing, fiscal policy easing, credit policy easing, but we don't think China is going to restart that property engine like they did in 2008, 2009, 2015, 2016. That part is over. So we think the reaction function, the trend that China is moving away from a property-driven growth, that's set. The train has left the station. So it will be more consumption-oriented, will be non-property investment-oriented stimulus to help China cushion the blow from higher tariffs from the US. I'll end there and happy to carry on the conversations later.
Thanks. Thanks. So the interesting thing is that all of our panelists have talked a bit about how the system will adapt to these potential shocks. What I'd like to explore in the first round of questions, and then hopefully there'll be more questions as well from the floor, is various elements of the system adaptation, if you like. Now, it might be some of the aspects of institutional kind of responses, might be around how some of the blocks will respond, emerging economies, and that's already been mentioned. Europe, perhaps, might respond in this rather more volatile trade environment that might come with the new US administration. And maybe, Ian, if I start with you, could you reflect a bit on that? I know you've got some interest in how Europe might adapt in this circuit, but you may want to go elsewhere. In terms of system adaptation, if there were to be a tariff or trade shock, how do you see the other players reacting to this?
Okay, thank you. I will get to that, but let me make some observations very quickly. I think Hui said something, I will take that literally. She said, nobody knows what will happen. Okay, it's a very important point in the context of the kind of the policies. We can speculate. I mean, we do a lot of scenario analysis. We will have our scenarios. But for the moment, whatever we look at, the business as usual, those details come up, and then we will adjust our numbers accordingly. The second point on debt issues, the big thing is that the debt problem these low-income countries, lower middle-income countries are facing very, very serious. It is not just a debt problem. There has been a little bit of unfreeze when it comes to market access, but some of them are still unable to have access to markets. But this problem has this debt dimension, but it is also a very serious demographic problem, as I mentioned. These highly indebted countries are the countries they are going to produce, they are already producing a lot of young people. So the fact that they are squeezed, they are unable to allocate funding, enough funding for education, health, huge implications, and those implications will cascade for generations. The second important observation, these are the countries that are most vulnerable to climate shocks. So they are heavily indebted, they have a huge demographic challenge. Third, they are subject to climate shocks. I agree that there is this idea of kick the can down the road, see what happens. But you know, in the context of low-income countries, we have a very good example. In the 1980s, these countries had a debt crisis. Global community kicked the can down the road. What happened? 2 decades, there was almost no growth. And when you look at what happened over the past 10 years, 15 years, there was no per capita growth in these countries. So now whether global community will find a way to help or not, that's a question, you know, we discuss. But whether there is a solution needed or not, that's not a question. A solution is needed. The shape of that solution could be different. There are different ways of thinking about debt relief. We can discuss that. The point about what you ask, what these countries can do, I think there are good reasons to be optimistic. Whatever the policies put on the table by major economies. In the context of Europe, as well as in the context of, I think, many emerging developing economies, there are good reasons to basically first say growth comes from the forces at home. Yes, external environment is important, but you look at the growth accelerations, the domestic forces play a significant role. The big question is that how you mobilize those domestic forces. And in many cases, having a global environment that's friendly, that amplifies the benefits of reforms, but those reforms are necessary. And in many cases, they are somewhat delayed. Europe is, I think, a perfect example of that. And when you look at many emerging market economies, there are good reasons to think about how they can accelerate investment growth. I will talk about just the foreign direct investment. In the first the decade of this century, we had foreign direct investment peaking to around 7 to 8% of total GDP, global GDP. Last year, that number was below 2%. We had basically foreign direct investment decline across the board and dramatically. Now, yesterday we talked about there is a lot of liquidity out there. Private sector is looking for places to invest. Then the question is how public entities, governments especially, can undertake reforms to attract that investment, to bring capital back to these economies in a way that are, you know, conducive to address the very large investment needs. By the way, these investment needs, when I mentioned the climate challenge, are not investment needs you are building bridges to nowhere. There is a need to basically put a lot of effort into infrastructure, into digitalization. So how it is done? In many cases, you basically think about how the institutions are working, how the policy frameworks established, and how you can have a medium-term plan, as I said, you can accumulate debt, but you need to have a medium-term plan to basically take care of that debt accumulation. In many cases, we do not have that medium-term plan. So in a sense, this era of heightened policy uncertainty could help governments to push the levers of reform and hopefully see better outcomes.
Okay, thank you. Joachim, do you want to come in? I know Eric has had his hand up, so he may want to come in on this particular point. So maybe we come to Joachim first, and then we'll go to Eric. You? Oh no, let Eric go. Okay, go on. You.
No, I just there are 2 points I wanted to make. One was that in this choice that you described between pretend, extend and pretend, and do it once and for all. What happened during COVID was, extend and pretend. What we need, I think, is a very serious effort, and we have probably never had better motives or better justifications for a major debt relief, thinking of COVID and the needs for climate investment. That was the first point. The second point I wanted to make and is that the second half or the last slides in your presentation and what you now described as well, I think is very much an upside. I mean, for many emerging and developing economies, the current situation with quite a lot of capital available to or willing to go in, if you can provide the sort of right climate or climate investments, and you can align your policies that will attract capital. We have never seen, and your data shows that as well, that this is a very important opportunity. The problem with that is, of course, that today almost all of this financing is happening in dollars or hard currencies, and I think the very real risk here is that we will build up a new vulnerability, and you mentioned that towards the end of your comments now, and we will build it up in dollars, and so I think what we really need to focus on now is how can we get more of this coming in terms of local currency financing? How can we, and here I think the MDBs have a very particular responsibility to try to create the kind of vehicles that can allow us to do more local currency financing, and also at the same time develop the capital markets and financial systems of these countries. Without that, I think this kind of investment push that we want to see and we need to see globally could become a disaster. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. And in fact, I mean, it's interesting. It ties to a comment that was made last night, because there was an interesting intervention, I think recently by Jose Viñals, around this whole role of the MDBs and some of the joint statement around the spring meetings. But Joachim, over to you in terms of your reflections on the discussion.
Okay, first I comment on the side of also good news. It's this G20, we managed to get a communique. I think it's always something small but relevant. In terms of MDBs, I think what you mentioned and include the vulnerability to climate and so on really shows the importance of adaptation, like we discussed yesterday. Given the limited amount of money, the investments, of course, the development investment will continue to be an issue, and there's no magic there. Someone who have to bear the risk. We do believe that reforms are helpful, but sometimes things go beyond reforms. But it's not an issue. Neither that nor the problem of investment, the cooperation is an issue of emerging markets or poor countries. Again, going back to my comment on the nominated Secretary of the Treasury, he has been very vocal about, for instance, the growth of gold and what it means both to the dollar as well as to the faith on public debt. So I think it's something we all have to think about. But I take, given the discussion you have, I take an example. we know that we have to go to, address climate, and it's so important that we do that in efficient ways. And again, only with cooperation, we can take advantage of all the possibilities of having affordable solutions. Now, we all have just read what happened to this important venture in Europe, the Northvolt, that could not really deliver what we expect. I think it's an example of what we can do better. When I think, for instance, Latin America and Europe, there's so much Latin America can provide to make the energy transition more affordable to Europe. It's something that is very high in their objective. And there are many ways of doing that. But for this, you need trade. You cannot have restrictions. I take an example I mentioned before. Biofuels. If you restrict the kind of biofuels that you accept, if you restrict the kind of, say, sustainable aviation fuel, so you get only very particular things that are extremely expensive, we are not going to move. So you are hindering the growth of a number of areas, and at the same time, you're getting further and further away from your objectives. So I think the climate actually ought to be, say, a stimulus for thinking in more efficient, more cooperative ways to address it. And you mentioned how much growth you'll be below what you used to have just a decade ago. I think that if you take the opportunity of the common challenge, and with Siddharth, we were discussing about commons. Exactly, this is one of the major commons. Maybe you need some structure to help in this process. And in a way, IMF is already helping indeed. They took, it would be important that in addition of what management has already done, that we get all the governing boards of the IMF reinforcing this. And actually, we even proposed to create something that's already in the articles there, but a ministerial group that would empower IMF to help bring things together so that you can address the two problems that we have ahead, and maybe also a third problem that we discussed a bit yesterday, and we're not discussing here, which is all the impact that IT, AI, and so on you have. It could be a great solution to this demographic change, or it can be a great course for everybody. Again, is there a place where this can be discussed? I mean, very open, maybe more open than we are used to do, say, 20 years ago. I think that we have all learned how much important to have inclusiveness, to have other people at the table, and so on and so forth. But still, it's important to have a fora where we could discuss this in a very systematic way, and not only discuss, also to make decisions, take action. And this can be so valuable to everybody, rich country, advanced economies, those that are more endowed with natural resources, those that are less endowed. So I think when I look at the next few years, in spite of all the noise, because the threat of climate will not disappear, ultimately, we will have to find, like you suggested, what kind of institution can help us to navigate this.
Thank you, Joachim. Reza, over to you, your reflections.
Thank you, Anton. I wanted to come and share my few thoughts around, how should the rest of the world position itself? But before that, if time permits, I also wanted to ask a question to Ayan, if there is time, which is about, we speak a lot about fragmentation of trade and the fact that these tariffs are going to undermine trade. Yet I'm not sure what is the right level of trade in the world. So we know imports in percent of GDP, were around 30% of GDP. Now they're a little over 25% of GDP. But that 30% came on the back of a very rapid acceleration of trade more than global GDP. You also really wouldn't really expect forever trade to continue to grow more than GDP. So what is the right level And how do you go about it? And I'd be curious, for thoughts around that. But so I want to now talk a little bit. If you're an emerging market, you're not the US, you're not China, what do you do? And, I have three main points that I would like to make. I think the first point is the premium to being neutral. When two big boys fight, it's a good idea to not be anywhere close to either camp and, to just watch from a distance. I live in the UAE and His Excellency is here, and I've been there for the past 2 years, and I've come to have a lot of respect for how, for instance, just as an example, the UAE positions itself as a very neutral place, really a place to do business. You want to do value creation, you have all the infrastructure, you want to do deals in the West, you want to do deals in the East, it's a neutral place to do so. I think there's a great premium there for the rest of the world. Second, we had a really enlightening session yesterday, right before closing, on Chinese enterprises going abroad. And I think, there are some structural reasons from the perspective of the Chinese economy for how, Chinese entrepreneurs may be looking for better return to capital elsewhere. And now we're going to have these headwinds from the US where there's going to be more tariffs. And, some of this is going to be structural, whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. So in my view, actively trying to court a lot of these Chinese, manufacturers and investors is a great message to me, because you are well positioned from both sides. A lot of interest from China's side, and being able to export to markets like the US without necessarily having the consequences of the tariffs from China. And my last point is something I just want to echo that I came up a couple of times is, in a world where there will be more unpredictability from the largest superpower in the world, and in a world where dollar is the payment system of the world, I think I wanted to re-emphasize what I said yesterday, that for many other countries, it is important to invest in alternative payment systems. And we spoke how about maybe one global payment system is a global good, but really, this is a national issue. This is an issue of sovereignty. And if a country takes a neutral stance in a conflict, take the Russia and Ukraine conflict, many countries are neutral, but they've been affected as bystanders because of the threat of sanctions. So in my view, that sort of reinforces the premium to having alternatives, because neutral countries should not necessarily have to suffer from the threat of sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you, Reza. Hui, over to you. I mean, your thoughts on how blocks might move, and again, you may want to reflect on China's role, given what colleagues have said about a number of issues.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting and thought-provoking points being raised here. And one thing came to my mind, which is something I've been thinking, the speed of policy implementation, whether it's climate change or whether it's a debt management, thinking in the context of China, I think even though we know the direction of the policy is correct, how fast or how slow you implement that policy is very important, right? Thinking about climate change, right? For China's context, you can look at the reports, and a lot of researchers will say it's 100 trillion RMB investment that needs to be done for China's decarbonization. But at what point do you invest do you front load all the investment at the very beginning, or how do you manage that speed? It's very important, because you look at the solar industry, prices of the solar cells have dropped 80–90% over the past few years. So if you invest upfront, you're going to lose a lot of money. So, and with the technology as well, I look at the very impressive manufacturing capability of China and how much Chinese, whether it's an EV, whether it's a battery, whether it's other equipment and machinery production, right? It's certainly the right direction, higher value added and more productive forces in China. But the speed of which could be generating problems. If you don't have, because the manufacturing sector doesn't hire a lot of people. Most people still work in a non-manufacturing sector. So if you don't have a very well-developed unemployment insurance system or social safety net, the speed at which you're pushing that button could generate some side effects that as policymakers, you don't want to see. A debt as well. I look at some of the DM countries, for example, in the US, they did spend a lot of money. The fiscal expansion during COVID is huge, but now you look at debt to GDP level, it came down, right? So you have to manage the speed and the pace of it so that debt in itself is not a problem. But when we look at China, why the local governments are facing so much issues, you have this housing downturn and you're forcing local governments to manage down its debt at the same time. That's going to cause trouble. So when I hear my co-panelists' discussion, the speed at which you implement policies, that came to my mind. And it requires a lot of skill, experience, and forward-looking part of a policy making when we manage all these challenges, climate change, demographics, debt, all these challenging issues. I think it's a kind of even more of an ask for policymakers and policy advisors how to implement even if we all agree what we should be doing.
Thank you. Now, the audience are enjoying hearing you so much that I've been handed a note that we should continue speaking until 12. So this is really good news because we can now, I think, open it up to the floor. And if there are one or two questions, and please, if you could keep the questions quite concise, we can then allow the panel to respond. Does anybody wish to ask? Yes, over there. Okay. Maybe we can get another microphone. Is it working?
Hello?
Yes.
Thanks so much for this interesting panel. So obviously from yesterday and today discussion, we understand that the trend is the weaponization of trade and economy, and few countries are choosing economic sovereignty. Yesterday we discussed about sanction as a weapon. We discussed about tariff as a weapon. And today we speak about a defensive reaction to these weapons as controlling the depreciation of the currency, readjusting the supply chain, and thinking about a global payment system. What other tools are available to mitigate the weaponization of economy? Are those tools include bilateral agreements as well? Thanks.
That's a very good question. What might the response be? And perhaps also, if I can add another nuance, when the first Trump sanctions came in 2016, I think some people were theorizing sort of with neoclassical economics that this would, because the US is a large country, this would have, lower prices. In fact, it didn't turn out like that. The US, actually, a lot of the costs of the tariffs ended up rebounding on the US. So, I mean, if you could answer the question, but also look at how some of the unpredictability of how tariffs actually work in a modern economy as opposed to the standard neoclassical trade model, because in a sense, this relates to Reza's point. What is the right percentage of trade as a proportion of GDP? Well, that kind of depends what you think the economic model is. Because if it's a neoclassical model, then it's a different answer. So, but these are sort of interrelated points. Who would like to come in on that first? Any thoughts? Ian.
So, what can countries do, and what they shouldn't do in response to possibility of more tariffs or sanctions? I think I completely agree with Reza on the issue of sanctions and the need for countries to think about alternative mechanisms. There is always the issue of whether these are globally optimal solutions. They could be optimal for countries to react. But one thing we know, over time, actually, there are great benefits, countries signing agreements with each other in the context of trade and in the context of investment. a lot of countries signed bilateral investment treaties. The number of those treaties has declined dramatically over the past 2 decades, actually. Number of trade agreements has declined dramatically. Now, what is important is that when these trade agreements and investment agreements are deep, they cover, quite a bit of sectors, they are very useful in terms of protecting countries against tariffs from their, the partners as well as the non-partner countries. And we have done some work, and the deep trade agreements actually do make a big difference if you have those types of agreements and investment agreements. The second point I would make, look, we had, emerging market financial crisis in the 80s and the 90s. What many countries did, they basically start accumulating very large amount of foreign currency. So there's nothing wrong with, again, saving and accumulating currency, but there is this idea of using that currency for other purposes rather than constantly thinking about insurance. So in the context of what countries can do, now countries are thinking about accumulating gold. Some central banks have been aggressively doing that. But whether that's the kind of the optimal way of thinking about savings and how to use those savings, there are big questions in the context of how to use those savings. Very quickly about this optimal level of trade. Obviously, that depends on what type of model we are thinking. But here is the kind of my basic response to that. Trade is all about market expansion. That expansion can take place, whether maybe the country is selling the same types of goods. The Prime Minister Shipley talked about elegantly on these issues in the case of New Zealand. Take New Zealand. New Zealand used to sell its wonderful wine, cheese, all the agricultural products to advanced economies. But now selling a lot to China and some emerging markets. Hopefully, 5-10 years from now, they will sell it to Africans because they will acquire that type of fine taste to have, pure organic products. So that there is this market expansion that will continue. Or, of course, there are new products increasingly driving global trade. And when you look at, goods trades are stable, in some cases contracting, but huge expansion in services trade. And that services trade now gets into areas we didn't think possible 5 years ago, 10 years ago, like this remote nursing, remote medical services. And Asian countries have been, at the forefront of this. So I wouldn't basically worry about there is this maximum level of trade relative to global GDP. I would worry about impeding trade one way or another that will basically end up with losing one of the main engines of economic growth for many of these small open economies.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to come in on this question? Otherwise, No? Okay. Any further questions? Siddharth, yes.
Thank you. So I have a question. In the last 30, 40 years, the globalization of trade, currency, payment system was the single force for betterment of humanity. All three have been weaponized. I think the panel needs to expand its horizon. The Trump term is for 4 years. And to recommend alternative systems is moving this world towards ultimate fragmentation. So the question to the panel is that the Trump term is 4 years and there's world after that. What way should policymakers adjust if Trump goes in that direction? Because there's an afterworld. This is not going to end with what Trump brings in.
Great question. So beyond Trump too, Joachim.
Well, I think this is, goes a little bit on what we're saying, that we have to look beyond the wave that is coming, and we have to continue to reinforce the institutions. We do have problems that will go beyond trade, and I think climate is one, and also economic forces. I like to remind people that in spite of all the declarations from Trump about coal and protecting coal and how terrible the Democrats had been about coal. Fact is that during his presidency, the coal production went down and actually made the U.S. one of the countries with the biggest decline in emissions. So yeah, we have to separate some of the rhetoric, some of the risks. This is why I say let's not be too worried, and let's think about the end game, and yeah, reforming, rethinking, tweaking, maybe even creating other institutions. But I'm definitely, I hear what Siddhartha say. We know about a few things that have been working. We do see actually countries willing to do this. I mean, we hear China be willing to involve in a number of things, and this is why I also mentioned G20. I mean, we're in Brazil next year. We're going to have this COP in Brazil. It will be again an opportunity to be in a neutral ground in discussing important things. So I think keeping the eyes beyond that is important, and in a way, if we react to it strongly, maybe it'll be hard to come back. And well, we don't know if Trump will be succeeded by someone else, but there are changes that are permanent, but it does mean that we have to throw away some of the good things we have. I sometimes I remember again talking about the U.S. I mean, we had this Andrew Jackson, the president. I mean, he changed the country in some things in a temporary way, other things in a permanent way. But anyway, life continued. Actually, technology and trade were the basis of growth in the U.S. at that time, and remain the same today. So we should have a careful attention to Bretton Woods institutions at different level, both MDBs and all the other MDBs. People have devoted a lot of time, but also strengthening the IMF, and like I said, having the governing board bodies providing even more, say, of a mandate to management and all the people who are there.
Thank you. Eric.
So picking up Siddhar's question, and also maybe tying it to the previous question, and looking at it from Reza's perspective of being, you know, not US, not China, but an emerging economy. If we look back at Trump 1, it was all about bilateral agreements. But what happened? Well, we had RCEP in Asia, you know, a very ambitious and a broad trade agreement. US decided to stay out of CPTPP, you know, probably the most promising trade agreement being developed, and there is, you know, a very small but still a potential that China might join that as well, which would be transformational. Again, this may not be in the cards, but if I were in that sort of Reza's position, I would look at those kind of opportunities rather than bilateral agreements. On the Bretton Woods institution. So I've been in and out of these institutions for more than 20 years now, and I've never seen in the multilateral development banks the type of collaboration and genuine reform, and recognizing that it has been under 3 successive emerging market G20 presidencies that these changes have happened. And I think India certainly signaled very strongly its support for the MDB system and for it to push reforms further. Brazil has taken on that agenda, very successfully. We now have South Africa. I really think that there is a dynamics here, and I want to really, as to end on that, or at least keep that note in mind when we leave this conversation, that there is real change going on, and I think there's even, I think Sidar, you are, very involved in thinking about, what is the next step for the IMF, and I think there is also there, quite an interesting agenda that could sustain this support for these institutions, and hopefully we'll get back to something more promising than a lot of this bilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Any further thoughts on Siddharth's question? Reza?
I think Siddharth absolutely correct on trade and globalization and its benefits, and therefore all the more reason for these institutions to make sure they invest in what they need to really appeal to, I think, a broad set of emerging markets, that they are their institutions. I think it's safe to say that most emerging markets would right now feel there isn't that much ownership. They don't feel that much ownership in many of these institutions. So all the more for IMF, World Bank to work in those areas. I think I'll come back to on one question around payment systems and dollar clearing and one. So that is a global good, no doubt. I think if it was administered like a global good, with there being, say, from all important players, some checks and balances to protect against policy uncertainty from one large economy, then I think it would make sense. But I think, to me, the lesson from the elections is not that a Trump administration comes in, but just the higher variance, and whether emerging markets need to be exposed to that risk or not, and why not actually have one or two other systems. In this day of technology, the friction costs or these other costs of having multiple systems now these costs can be surely a lot less. And policymakers in countries are accountable to their populations. They're not accountable to a global public good notion.
Thank you. Hi, Annie, you want to come in?
So let me quickly make these 3 points, and I'm very happy Sidar asked that question. It is very important to keep in mind life goes on. There's 4 years, beyond 4 years. And and I cannot comment on specific countries' policies, what they would do, what they wouldn't do. But, smoking is bad for your health. It can become fashionable, but it doesn't change the truth. It is bad for your health. So countries can adopt certain policies. There's nothing wrong with them experimenting with these policies. But if they are the wrong policies, those policies will backfire. So that's the number one observation. I think we don't want to start smoking, and we don't want many people smoking at the same time. As much as, I see lots of people have this tendency, oh, it's great, maybe there is something here shiny, tariffs, industrial policy, let me experiment. The second point is that many of these problems are global problems. You cannot solve these problems in Beijing, Washington, D.C., or Brussels. You need to solve these problems talking to each other, finding solutions. The climate problem is like that. So as long as problems are global, we won't be able to solve them by fragmenting the global economy. And the third observation is that there are certain problems that will definitely require countries working together. And demographics is one of them. In advanced economies, in China, there is a lot of activity, but there are not enough people to work. In other countries, there is not much activity, but there are a lot of people, they need to be employed. So the idea that we will basically swim against the tide and pretend that there is no problem will make this problem even bigger. As I said, problems rarely solve themselves. They will require solutions. And I hope that, I want to be optimistic. Like Eric said, there is a lot of work to be done in the context of MDBs, I think there is huge momentum to bring the private sector, the public sector, and all types of facilities we have. So I would like to be optimistic about the future.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to ask an out-of-the-box question. I don't know whether anybody has read a Michael Crichton novel or watched Jurassic Park, which is a Hollywood movie about dinosaurs. But what Michael Crichton does is he sets a really life-threatening situation, and then he halves it in time. So your heart rate goes right up. So my question is, 2030, if the world doesn't achieve its commitments on NDC targets, so climate targets, the world ends, full stop. And we can't rely on politicians. We can't change the politicians. It's the financial sector that is going to save the planet. So what are you going to do? What would you do? What should the financial sector do in the next 5-6 years?
Well, that's a provocative question. If I turn to Hui first, since you work for Goldman Sachs, do you have any thoughts on that question?
It's a difficult question and it's not my expertise, but I'm a believer of low-hanging fruits. I think a lot of times when we are having intellectual discussions, once we get to a very high level and grand schemes, then our views can differ. Is a cyclical policy better or structural policy better? Should we do this way or that way? But I'm a believer that we can find a common ground and things that make sense at the, regardless of your view on structural, cyclical, or big picture approaches. I remember going to Professor Abhijit Banerjee's talk on climate change. And in his talk, I think there are a lot of low-hanging fruits. It doesn't require a huge amount of investment. And as a member of the financial community, we can certainly work together and pick those low-hanging fruits. So my simple answer is that can we find some low-hanging fruits to get started, even if we don't know by 2030 whether we're going to achieve the goal that we set for ourselves.
Thank you. Eric, you want to come in?
No, just when you started your question, I thought you were referring to us as the dinosaurs, but no, but I do think that I agree that the financial system is extremely important. And, if we look at the kind of investments you're going to need to address the issue, there are different numbers, but you'll need a very significant part coming from domestic resource mobilization. You're going to have a very significant part, maybe 1/3, coming from the MDB system, and the rest would have to be the private sector. And I think what we absolutely need is to see the links between these, and particularly in emerging developing economies. And I spoke earlier about the risks of pushing in a lot of capital into these economies without dealing with the weaknesses in the financial system, both on the side of the banking system, which are most of these countries, it's really about the banking system, but also thinking about how can we make financial markets work better and so on. So, if we can get those things right, I think the private sector will come in, and there is a lot of capital really wanting to have this kind of return, looking at ESG or other types of kind of additional returns that will help us address the climate change challenge. And it is indeed, the most immediate challenge, but there are also other things around, the loss in biodiversity and so on, which are very closely related, but requires the same kind of thinking around the role of the financial system.
Thank you. Joachim.
Well, I think that, of course, the financial sector, you play a big role, but here I talk a bit as someone who works in a bank. We have to remind first that basically banks do deal with other people's money. So this requires some caution on what you do. It's not proprietary money normally. Second, so you need an environment to be effective for the financial sector really deliver what it can deliver. You need an environment. Eric mentioned, and yesterday we discussed about SSIB, ISSB, and the importance of having companies disclosing things. The idea that banks can be centers in companies is tricky. I mean, I've known Larry Fink for, at least 15 years, and we have seen all the back and forth that he has lived. And I'm sure that he's as committed to climate that he was 5 years ago or more. So I think there is much to work. Also, like I mentioned yesterday, in Brazil, green is becoming almost mainstream, but this is in part because of the environment we work. Even yesterday, there was the central bank issued something that will make all the banks, especially the systemically important banks, by 26 to disclose their portfolio, basically adhere to ISSB, and then the small second group, it will be by 27, at least in a reasonable way, okay, and then in verifiable way, etc. So I think, yes, the financial sector will have a very important role. It's actually, you're not going to achieve that without the financial sector, but the expectation that we can move alone, I think it might be, exaggerated. And actually, this is one reason why SG has, working hard to get some standards. And yesterday we also discussed about the unification of standards, so that also the cost of compliance comes down. And again, people have more confidence when they take a decision that these will be effective, these will not be contradicted by a rule here, a rule there, and so on. So I think this will be increasingly important. And again, it fell a little bit, it falls a little bit in the remit of institutions like the IMF, and then some G20 institutions to continue to have this push in financial institutions.
If I can abuse my role as moderator just for a second, because your question takes me to an interesting consideration, I think. I used to be a director until recently of a pension fund, a large pension fund, so it had to do some very long-term asset and liability planning. And one of the things we started considering is exactly the scenario you set out, which is the disorderly climate transition. And it's really complicated because most of the kind of macroeconomic models that we use for asset liability management just go by the wayside if you have. And it becomes very, very complicated to look at scenario-based macro forecasts, which is, what if you're in this place, what if you're in another place? And I think this is one of the really interesting things that the sector will also need to think in that kind of disorderly scenario, how it can best optimize its asset allocation. And that gets very, very complicated. So that's another variable that would need to be thrown into the mix. I think, the disorderly scenario you set out is not a smooth macroeconomic transition. Does anybody else want to come in on this question, or? No? If not, look, I think that takes us to our limit. This has been a terrific panel. I think they've done a wonderful job answering your questions, and also they've worked very hard, so their productivity is much higher than we had planned at the beginning of the conference. So thank you all again for your contributions.